Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Loving obeisances unto the Supreme Being Vasudeva, who is everything there is. Janmadyasya yato anvayaditaratascha abhignaswarat tene brahma hridaya adikavaye muhyanti yat surayah tejo vari mridam yatha vinimayo yatra trisargo mrisha damna swena sada nirastakuhakam satyam param dhimahi. We meditate upon the transcendent absolute being from whom springs forth this universe. He is present in all that exists and yet distinct from everything. He is fully conscious and totally independent. He revealed to the first seer Brahma the import of Vedic wisdom. The material creation made of threefold gunas appears in him as though real, like water in a mirage. Being eternally self effulgent, he is ever free of the illusion, maya, of the material world. We meditate upon him, the Supreme Being. Nigamakalpataror galitam phalam shukamukadamrita dravasanyutam pibata bhagavatam rasamalayam muhuraho rasika bhuvi bhavukaha. O devotees who relish a taste for divine love, Bhagavatam is the fully ripened fruit of the wish-yielding tree of Vedas, flowing as immortal nectar from Shuka Brahmarshi. Go on drinking the sweet nectar day after day. We are now entering the 13th chapter of the 5th Skandha of Bhagavatam. We are in the story of Jadabharata, who is instructing King Rahughana. We saw the beautiful instructions of Jadabharata to King Rahughana in explaining to him the nature of the self and the process of detaching from the mind through inquiring into the falsity of it, and thereby recognizing that the only truth is consciousness alone, the Supreme Being, and abiding as pure consciousness. Now, he also proceeds in this 13th chapter to relate an allegory to drive home the point of why it is so foolish to be caught up in so many attachments and thereby to be free of it. So he says the worldly activity, the path of worldly activity is like a dense forest, and it's like a company of merchants entering the dense forest. People enter this. So he equates people to a company of merchants who are of various categories which represent the various gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, and dominated by each of these gunas, this company of merchants, they enter this forest looking for wealth in the forest. And when they enter the forest, he says there are 6 highwaymen, who among them one being the chief, who is the most unworthy, and they together rob them. And not only that, there are jackals and wolves who take away their property. And then after that, he continues that in this forest they are harassed by mosquitoes and gnats, insects, and so on, in this place which is dense with shrubs and creepers and all that. And yet they witness some kind of an imaginary city far away inside the forest, and therefore they are chasing that imaginary city. But instead they find various ogres and demons there, and fire breathing from different places. Then therefore they run here and there, and they are not even able to see the place clearly because it is all looking smoky with fire and smoke from all directions. And then they hear shrill notes of crickets and bats from different directions, and then they see owls hooting in front of them. So this is what they are seeing in this forest. They are chasing this imaginary city in the forest. They don't find the city, but instead they are faced with all this. And then meanwhile, they get very hungry in the forest, and so they run after here and there looking for food in the forest. And then they are thirsty, and then they see water, but it turns out to be a mirage. Then they run further, and then they find a forest conflagration. It seems very bright, so they run towards it, but it's actually a forest fire, and they get scorched with that fire. And then they run in a different direction, and there are demons who are ready to kill them, so they have to run away from them. then tired, they faint somewhere on the way, and then finally it looks like they found their imaginary city and they are very happy, and they rejoice for a short time, only to recognize that this city is no great city at all, but it's only a appearance, only an illusion. What is really there is only treacherous animals and all kinds of other dangers. So then they start climbing up further, and then their feet are hurting. Meanwhile, these merchants are all walking along with their families, and they're not able to support them. They're all uh, having hunger and thirst, as we already saw. So they're getting angry at each other, and they are walking along like this, and then suddenly there is a huge python which swallows them and then spits them out. For some time they are without consciousness inside the python, and then it just spits them out, and then they somehow regain consciousness, and then they are looking after honey here and there. They are not able to find anything, and meanwhile they are afflicted by the cold, the sun, the storm, the rain. So this is all the condition of these company of merchants who are entering this forest looking for pleasure, and all they are finding is one misery after another. And they don't even have a proper mat to sleep on. They don't have a proper place to have a pitch a tent and camp there. They are looking here and there, and despite all this misery, they are still between the company of merchants. They are looking at other people, and then the men and the women from different groups of this company, they fall in love and they marry each other. So they multiply their misery by forming attachments within this forest. When they are beset with so many miseries, they still somehow get attached to other people, and thereby they have babies there. And then meanwhile the older people of the company are dying, and they are not even able to carry them. So this is the state of this company of merchants. And then it also, Jadabharata continues this allegory by saying that they are looking for various places to get some food or some honey, but not finding anything. They just again run here and there, and they are not able to retrace their path. They are not able to reach the end of the forest. They are stuck in the forest. And then he says only a rare recluse in that company, one who is completely given up all attachments, one who is not interested in chasing anything in the forest. Jadabharata says such a rare being is able to come outside the forest. Most of them are either they're afraid of animals, and then sometimes they find some beautiful birds, and then they get attached to those birds, and then they don't realize that what they have found is just another fleeting appearance, and it's not going to help them with anything. And then suddenly they find some monkeys which are indulging in amorous sports, and then meanwhile they get further and further attached, and they are not able to extricate themselves. So therefore he says, Jadabharata, this is the nature of the people who are going through this world. He says this forest represents the world, and this company of merchants are the people who are going through one misery after another. So one who is devoted to the Supreme Being, one who realizes that there is nothing that is worth pursuing here, is alone able to perceive the supreme object of life. Because anyone who is put on track by Maya, or anyone who is deluded in this forest by this company of merchants, they are not able to figure out the supreme object of life. They are just chasing one illusory goal after another, and that's how they are lost. And so therefore he addresses the king, O Rahughana, you have also been chasing Maya in different ways, like this company of merchants. Realize this, and therefore give up all forms of attachment, be friendly with all beings, and take up the sword of wisdom, and with that cut off all attachments and worship the supreme being Sri Hari, and thereby be unattached to any sense pleasures, any worldly objects, and be free. So this is the instruction Jadabharata gives Rahughana, and Rahughana is very happy. Rahughana replies by saying, oh, this human birth is so rare, because in this human birth alone the mind is purified, through the company of exalted beings like you. He says, because of your supreme abidance in truth, just spending an hour with you, he says, he has only been there for an hour, and this conversation happened. He says, just a fellowship of an hour has completely removed all my ignorance, which was rooted in fallacious reasoning, and therefore, how great it is to be in association with a supreme enlightened being like you. He glorifies him. And then he says, therefore, hail to all the great sages like you, because they are the ones who deliver those who are caught in ignorance. He says, whatever their age may be, they may be old, they may be young, they may be, as we saw in the case of Jadabharata, he's a young man but not looking clean or not looking like a sage, just like an ordinary village dunce. And then some are very aged and some are looking like sages, and some who are young boys, like we saw with Sanaka and Sanatana, Sanandana, Sanat Kumara. So it can be in any form. The sages cannot be known by any outer form such as age or shape or gender or any such thing. Therefore, he says, let them all be glorified. He says, Namo Mahadbhyo Astu, Nama Shishubhyo, Namo Yuvabhyo, Namava Vatubhya. He says, whether they are Mahadbhyo, that is, whether they are elderly, or Namo Shishubhyo, whether they are really young children, Namo Yuvabhyo, whether they are young, whoever they may be, Ye Brahmana Gama Avadhuta Lingash Charanti Tebhyah Shivamastu Ragyam. He says, these great sages, they are Avadhutas, whichever form they are moving about in earth, and they bring auspiciousness to all. Thereby he glorifies them. So Sri Shuka, narrating this to Parikshit, says, O Parikshit, thus, having explained the true nature of the Supreme Self, out of compassion to Rahughana, the ruler of Sindhu, the supreme sage, Jadabharata, who was possessed of highest glory and who was adored now by Rahughana, he just walked away from there, and he is completely abiding fully in his own wisdom, uncaring about anything, and his mind is completely still, his brain is still, his mind is still, he is fully situated in pure awareness, and he walks off after advising Rahughana without a care and without any worry, ever in supreme bliss. And Rahughana too, being fortunate, though he actually insulted this great being, because of the compassion of the great being, he got the right instruction, and thereby he also was rid of his ignorance. So this is how the story ends. And Parikshit has one doubt though. Parikshit says, this is great to hear about the story of Rahughana being instructed by Jadabharata. You mentioned the story of Jadabharata, this allegory. There are many references in this allegory to various animals and various things. Not all of them are clear. Can you please explain them to me, the hidden meaning in them? So with this query, 13th chapter ends. So now we enter the 14th chapter, where Shuka Brahmarshi explains the allegory of Jadabharata in detail. He says, the six highwaymen, as we saw, the company of merchants, enter the forest, and there are six highwaymen, one among them being the chief, who is also the most unworthy. He says they are the five senses and the mind. So the sixth sense is always called the mind. Krishna also says in the Gita, Manashasthani Indriyani. There are six senses, five being sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, and the sixth being the mind. And the sixth is the head of all, and it's the most unworthy of all, because it's what takes one into delusion. So, with these six senses, this company of merchants are distracted. They are first lured in the forest by false promise of pleasures. Just that's what the senses do. They promise pleasures through all the five and the sixth sense of mind as well. And then when people run behind it, they the just as the highwaymen snatch away, the senses take away the vitality and the wisdom of the people who are caught in the senses. And not only that, he mentioned that there were jackals and wolves who took away their sheep and so on. He says that's nothing but one's own family men. They are close to us and they snatch away all the wealth that we have. They are only interested in taking away what is good for them. just as the jackals and the wolves do. And then he says, therefore, nobody gets to the path of devotion to Sri Hari, and they are caught in this net, in this Maya, in the forest, and that's what these six highwaymen and all these animals represent. He goes on to say, therefore, the money, whatever money that belongs to men, this company of merchants, for example, are men with wealth, and yet they are chasing after fleeting things. Therefore, Shuka advises that the right use of money is only for dharma, and the highest dharma is surrendering unto the Supreme Being. Therefore, it is that dharma alone that is worthy of using money for. To pursue money for anything else or to spend money on anything else will only take us to misery through these six highwaymen, as it said, through various pleasures, sensuous enjoyments of seeing, touching, hearing, tasting, smelling, and then running with thought behind different objects. Thereby, people are lost. And then he says that the various mosquitoes and gnats that are bothering them are nothing but the various pesky men we come across who are all only there to disturb us. So, just as there are so many mosquitoes in the forest that only bite us, similarly, there are so many men here who bite us. Similarly, as we talked about uh, crickets and bats, and then owls that are howling. All these represent various thieves, and also that he says the taxmen who are there to simply collect money, the king's servants. And then he goes on to say that the fire that we saw, the conflagration of fire, is not, but that they ran after only to be deceived, is nothing but is like running behind gold, because gold or money in general is what people run after only to be bitten by it. Similarly, similar to how the company of merchants ran looking for the light, and then they got scorched by the fire of the conflagration. And then he also goes on to say that in the forest, just as we saw how these company of merchants, they marry, even despite all this misery, they get married, they get into attachment, and then the just as we saw, the old men are left behind and they carry the newborn baby. And this is what happens in this world. People get attached, they multiply with attachment, and then they are not able to take care of each other. They get angry with each other, even within the family, within friends. There is always constant envy and yet dependence. So it's a mutual relationship of both uh, what is known as attachment as well as enmity. Both are going together, and everyone depends on each other for both this. They have some moments when they are nice, and there are some moments when they are angry with each other, and this goes on alternating all the time, while all their senses are constantly diverting them, deceiving them. And then he goes on to say that just as we saw in the forest, how they get drawn to some nice looking birds, and then they get deceived by them. This is similar to, he says, various philosophies that people get drawn to. People get drawn to different philosophies while going through the world of activities. They just get drawn to speculative philosophies instead of surrendering to the Supreme Being, which is the only truth, which is the only way to be free of this forest, only way to get out of the forest. They get trapped further in the forest by getting drawn to various beautiful looking birds and so on. And this is similar to how there are various flowery philosophies that people put out, which look very nice, and yet they trap them further in the forest of worldly attachment instead of surrendering totally. And we can see this very clearly in many ways, how there are many schools of teachings, for example, which are promising all kinds of various powers, or luring people with different promises, many fake gurus, and so on. So, this is what is compared to all these beautiful looking birds, which only are there to make the merchants go deeper into the forest without figuring a way out. So like this, he goes on to say that every aspect of the forest represents different aspects of the world. The python we saw, they also said there is a python that grabs them in the mouth and then spits them out, and then they lose consciousness and regain it. He says that's nothing but deep sleep. The python of deep sleep grabs us while we go through this. We are grabbed by deep sleep, and then we come out of it again in ignorance, and then we again restart and then go through the same process of running behind things. And then the imaginary city they saw, of course, is the various imaginary projections of happiness that people look for in this world. And then he says that all the other various pleasures they have, they fight with each other. So just as we saw in the forest, they have whatever property they have, the merchants fight with each other. And similarly, it is seen in this world that people fight with each other for their property. One snatches away the property, another comes and snatches that away. This goes on forever. And thereby, he says that there are so many obstacles. They go through joys and sorrows, likes and dislikes, fear and pride, and then they fall for the lure of a young, beautiful woman or a man, and then they get lost in attachment. So all of this is represented by the forest and the various animals and the various elements of the forest. All of this represents various aspects of our own worldly activities, and how people are lost in this, and thereby they are not able to recognize that the time, which is the supreme wheel chakra of the supreme being, is time itself, and this time is constantly moving and taking their lives away. And whoever it may be, right from the smallest ant all the way to Brahma, are all only within time, and they have no permanence in embodied form. And therefore, they are not able to recognize all this, and they are caught in the forest and they are running here and there. So he says, concluding with all this, therefore, you realize that no matter where you go in this forest, no matter what you run behind, the company of merchants can never find their way out unless they realize that all of this is only an illusion. The whole forest and the various attachments and the various entities in the forest, all of this are only deepening the attachment. And therefore, by recognizing this and by not getting attached to any of this, but by only doing what is necessary and surrendering completely, can one get out of this forest. And that's what is represented by this allegory. And therefore, he says, take to the discipline of devotion, the yoga of devotion, the supreme surrender, and thereby you can be free of this forest of worldly activity. So that's the inner meaning of this allegory of Jadabharata. Having explained this, Shuka now concludes the story of Jadabharata by saying that the son of Rishabha, we saw Bharata is the son of Rishabha who became Jadabharata, therefore he's called Arshabha. So, son of Lord Rishabha, Bharata, is so great that nobody can emulate him, just as no fly can emulate the great eagle Garuda. He is full of devotion, and he was able to walk away from everything very easily when he was an emperor. And of course, he became a deer, and then he was able to regain the supreme state very easily, and he was always abiding in the supreme being. And he says and he was always having this beautiful prayer in his heart, glorifying the supreme being, and that prayer alone, repeating that, gives all benediction. So the prayer is, he says, hail to the supreme being Sri Hari, who is the personification of all sacrifices, yajna, who is the head of all dharma, who is yoga personified, who carries out all rules and regulations and ways of life, who is the very embodiment of Sankhya, the wisdom of discernment and discrimination, who is the master of nature, Prakriti's head of Lord of Prakriti, and who is Narayana, obeisances unto him. This is the prayer that Jadabharata has in his heart, and this prayer he is always carrying with him, and this prayer is alone to give us benediction. So the prayer again in the verse, beautiful verses, Yajnaya Dharmapataye Vidhi Naipunaya Yogaya Sankhya Shirase Prakritishwaraya Narayanaya Haraye Nama. So Yajnaya, embodiment of sacrifice, Dharmapataye, head of Dharma, Vidhi Naipunaya, one who is expert in all rules and regulations, Yogaya, one who is embodiment of yoga, Sankhya Shirase, one who is the wisdom of discernment, Prakritishwaraya, Lord of nature, Narayanaya Haraye Nama, the Supreme Being, Narayana, offer my obeisances unto you. So this prayer of Jadabharata, he says, is the prayer that he carries in his heart. He carried this prayer even in the form of a deer, and then he came back, and now he roamed away as a completely enlightened being, unattached to anything. And then Shuka concludes by saying, whoever listens or recites or honors and celebrates the story of the royal sage Bharata, whose virtues are spotless and who is glorified by all the devotees, he is blessed in every way and attains the greatest benediction and doesn't have to seek anything from anyone. In other words, he simply by listening to the story of Jadabharata, who is a purely enlightened sage, just listening to the story, reading and listening to the story, removes all desires so that one doesn't have to desire anything. In other words, one can abide in the peace of our own being. So, with this chapter concludes, and the story of Jadabharata also concludes. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.